Thank you and welcome everybody. So I'm going to do two things, hopefully, in this talk. I'm going to speak briefly about Derek Jarman, who I'm sure for many of you needs no introduction, but just to, I suppose, summarize where I understand the kind of reception of Jarman's work to be in the UK context, particularly at this point. And then I'm going to talk more specifically about this exhibition, what we were hoping to do with it within the context of Glasgow and in relation to contemporary art. So two main areas of focus there. And I'm going to speak only briefly about individual works in the show, partly because they're very rich in their own right, and I don't think I can do justice to any of them, and I don't want to favour one over the other. So I'm gonna go briefly through that, and obviously hope that you will be keen to come and see the exhibition if you can, and engage with them more deeply that way. Anyway, really central to this whole venture is the work of Derek Jarman, and it's important, I think, that we are 30 years on from Jarman's death, as you can see from his dates here. Jarman's born in 1942 and died really before his time as a result of the AIDS crisis and the lack of effective treatment for HIV and AIDS at the time at which he contracted those illnesses. And in his life, Jarman made an incredible body of work, as has already been said, across different mediums. So I think really important for our show and really important for Jarman in his whole working life was the fact that he began as a painter, and his passion for that medium as a kid translated into a wish to go to art school, which in a kind of deal with his father ended up meaning that he had to do another degree first, a kind of proper degree first, and then could go to art school. And he went to the Slade, which became a really formative experience for him. And this is one of the earliest extant works of Jarman's that we have, a self-portrait from 1959. And he was a kind of immediate standout figure within his milieu, and was offered exhibitions and won prizes right out of art school in the 1960s. He had a debut exhibition at the Listen Gallery, run by Nicholas Logsdale, which was going to go on to be a very influential and important gallery, and showed a number of landscape works very much in the vein of this one, Landscape with Blue Pool, 1967. This is one of a number of works he was making at this time, using the then new acrylic paints like Aquatech that were available to create the ground, and a very kind of simple and yet evocative way of creating landscape using orthogonal lines on this ground, and then collage elements, often marbled paper, to make rock formations on those surfaces. And Jarman very interestingly describes these work in his journals and in his other writing about his career. He's a great journal keeper and publisher of books, as well as an artist filmmaker. He describes these works on one hand as being a kind of flirtation with the establishment, as the possibility of having a commercial career as a painter, which very quickly thereafter he gets kind of goes off on a detour or tangent from. And he also describes them as landscapes that were waiting for something to happen in them. And I think in the context of our exhibition and the work from this kind of larger group that we have is a 1967 painting Landscape with Sandbars, which seems like a premonition, I suppose, in the context in which we're showing it, of the landscape that he would become associated with in the later years of his life on the coasts on Dungeness. It strangely anticipates that in some ways. But he described them as waiting for something to happen, specifically in the context of the work that one of his close contemporaries, David Hockney, had made, which brought into British art in the 1960s an explicitly queer and homoerotic subject matter, whether that was boys in Californian pools, in famous work that Hockney made, or in earlier works like We Two Boys Together Clinging, and in other works that draw on the repertoire of magazines like Physique Pictorial. Jarman felt that Hockney's use of these kinds of subject matter had ruled it out as a possibility for him, at least at this point in time within painting. And in our exhibition, we start to see, in particularly a 1974 film shot on Fire Island called My Very Beautiful Movie, these same kind of coastal landscapes starting to be peopled and populated with explicitly queer homoerotic content. But in 1967, although that was the milieu that Jarman was living and working in, it hadn't yet made it into the iconography of his paintings. But it's a very beautiful painting in its own right and a kind of anchor point for the exhibition, the earliest thing in digging in our time, digging in another time, sorry. So I mentioned that Jarman gets detoured in a number of ways from his trajectory into the commercial art world as a painter. One reason is because he's given some design jobs early on that are too good to turn down. He's invited by Frederick Ashton to design for the Royal Ballet. He's invited by Ken Russell to design for the feature film The Devils. And those design gigs were represented in an earlier Hunterian exhibition that we had recently, Stage and Screen, where Jim Gordon's collection of theatrical and screen designs featured some pieces by Jarman. So he's kind of taken off into that world, and he's also becoming increasingly interested in the possibilities of Super 8 film. So this is a medium that is experimental, that is easy and portable, and that documents both the kind of queer milieu that Jarman is part of, his studio spaces, parties held at Bankside and Sloane Square, and people performing for the camera in movies that would be shown within that social context, but also the landscape again in works like Journey to Avebury. So that's represented, as I said, in our exhibition by a particular film, by a very beautiful movie, but it's part of a much larger sequence of films that run through the early 1970s. And then in 1976, Jarman makes his break into cinema, and I guess that is really where probably most people will have encountered his work, in one of any number of visually intense, imaginative, really unique movies from Sebastian in 1976. Jarman describes one of the very few genuinely independent movies ever made in the UK, partly because he was working with very small budgets, with a small cast and crew, and really was not trained in the conventional methods of film production. So he makes very unusual and different films as a result. Jubilee in 1978, which is a very closely associated with the punk movement, features people from that scene. So Adam Ant is one of the people in the film, Jordan. The film really is describing the collapse of the state and of social order in a way that feels very visionary. It's a kind of image of hell in lots of ways, and the connections between images of heaven and hell are very important in Jarman's work, as we'll see. He made films about other artists, Caravaggio, with Dexter Fletcher as one of the lead actors. A very important work, The Last of England in 1987, a kind of return to this more apocalyptic tenor, which really describes, I suppose, the Britain in the era of Margaret Thatcher, and at the end of what Jarman saw as a kind of collapse of empire, and the slow embers, the slow dying embers of empire being the backdrop for it. And then, and this is the crucial reference, I suppose, for the exhibition that we've made, The Garden in 1990. So this is made after the event of Jarman's diagnosis HIV positive and after his acquisition of Prospect Cottage, the fisherman's cottage that he made a second home in from 1987 onwards, and which is documented in particular in his very well-loved and much read and admired journal, Modern Nature. And it's this period that was of particular interest to me in making an exhibition around Derek Jarman. So Prospect Cottage, which is recently been the subject of a fundraising campaign by Art Fund in order to save this, take it into public ownership or into a kind of charitable status of ownership so that it can be used both as a visitor attraction and for artist residencies and remain as Jarman and his late partner Keith Collins had known it in their time living there. And apart from the fact that Jarman uses Prospect Cottage in his films, he uses it in The Garden particularly, it's famous because of the way that he made this very, very unique garden on the shingle, a very unpromising landscape for a gardener to work in a site that is itself incredibly modern and, again, maybe even dystopian, with the presence of the nuclear power station at Dungeness, visible from Prospect Cottage and from the garden. So Jarman is known and loved as a filmmaker, as a painter, as a writer, and as a gardener. In his own lifetime, he made an exhibition at the Design Museum about his garden, and more recently, the Garden Museum in London staged an exhibition in 2021, I think. My Garden's Boundaries of the Horizon focused on that. It's a well-known and important facet of his work. But I was really struck by the fact that in the journal Modern Nature, we're seeing accounts of the planting of the garden. We're seeing Jarman describing the flowers that he's hoping to cultivate. He's going to garden centres, he's going with friends, he's acquiring cuttings. He talks about the garden a lot, but he's also talking about his efforts to produce the film The Garden, which are in train at this period, and his working out of his own position as one of the very few public figures to be HIV positive and open about it in Britain in the late 1980s. And around this period, in the last 6 or 7 years of his life, his painting starts to take on, again, if we say that the early landscapes are waiting for something to happen, the later work starts to fill with text and with references to the politically mismanaged AIDS crisis, like deliberately mismanaged. And for Jarman, this is indexed to a wider homophobia in society, which is leading to the deaths of many of his friends and ultimately to Jarman himself. And this is a work we have in the show. We have a small number of works from the early 1990s that really point to this explicit activist content in Jarman's work and to this style of painting that is very quick, abrupt, energetic, and still looks incredibly fresh today. This is not one that's in the show, but I suppose indicative of Jarman's thinking around that time. This was a work that gave the title to a major exhibition he had in 1992 at the Manchester Art Gallery called Queer. And these works in recent years have been much more widely shown than they were for a long time. There's a renewed interest, I think, in general in that period of art as an activist practice connected to an urgent social issue. And then, very importantly, in the journal Modern Nature, we also see the beginnings of the ideas that would become Jarman's final film, Blue. We've worked very closely on the exhibition with James Mackay, the producer of Blue. We worked with James and with the theatre director Neil Bartlett to stage Blue Now, a live reimagining of this film at Tramway a week ago. And I think this other side of Jarman's practice that's so interesting, that he makes this very poetic, elegiac kind of film alongside the work he makes that's much more directly activist, feels again something that's so interesting and timely about this work. It remains of interest. And in that relationship between a work about the end of life, about going into the void, into the blue, the voices that you hear there, the sense of elegy that's so strong in it, the very beautiful visual experience that you have, a very haunting experience of watching the film, and this activist work. I think Jarman was one of those artists who responded to what the art historian and critic Douglas Crimp described as the kind of double injunction for people living through the AIDS crisis, that they would practice both mourning and militancy. And this synthesis of these two facets, again, is so interesting in Jarman's work. And I'm not going to be able to remember and name all of the many brilliant exhibitions that have also explored this territory. I think it's really important to say the exhibition we've made is part of a much wider resurgence of interest in Jarman's practice. Could trace that back to Isaac Julian's exhibition for the Serpentine Brutal Beauty quite a few years ago now, and then more recently shows like this, Protest at the Irish Museum of Modern Art and Manchester Art Gallery, shows at Le Kodak in Paris, shows in Berlin, a show which has a very similar title to ours, Derek Jarman's Modern Nature, at the John Hansard Gallery in Southampton. There have been lots of interest in Jarman as a historical figure and in this work and its multifaceted character. So one of the questions I've had in making this show is just how to do something distinct and rooted in Glasgow in a particular way. And I suppose in that way, I've returned to my own starting point with this project, which was 12 years ago when I was invited to be part of a project at CCA Glasgow about its own archive and prehistory as another organisation called the Third Eye Centre. And having read Modern Nature, I was really fascinated by Jarman's account of coming to Glasgow in 1989 to make a live kind of performance installation and exhibition for the Third Eye Centre and for the National Review of Live Art. And this is what we see documented here. He pasted homophobic tabloid headlines on the columns and walls of the gallery. He made tarred bed paintings that covered the walls. And at the centre of this was the image of queer love, same-sex couples, often including Jarman's own partner, Keith Collins, sometimes two women, lay in the bed during gallery opening hours. And this was a bed rudimentarily made from rough materials, covered with barbed wire, but at the center of it, something incredibly ordinary and domestic, just two people in bed together. They're at the center of this storm that whirls around them, not of their own making. And this particular relationship between Glasgow and Jarman's oeuvre, and this moment here, you see a detail from that show I mentioned, Isaac Julian's Brutal Beauty in 2008, showing one of these bed paintings. That felt like it could be the root of something distinct for Glasgow about Jarman, and that it would stick really quite closely to his account of it in Modern Nature. And we have excerpts from Modern Nature within the exhibition. So this one in particular documents the beginning of Jarman's project when Neil Bartlett, theatre director we've mentioned already, director of Blue Now, at this time invited to be the kind of MC of the National Review of Live Art. He calls Jarman and describes this possibility. And in the same moment, Jarman is telling Neil about Dungeness, about the garden, about the driftwood there, the nuclear power station. In that same diary entry, 1st of June 1989, he describes the transformation of the project of Blueprint into Bliss at the beginning of what would be the film Blue. And I was so interested in this catalytic sense of this invitation and its weaving together of all these other strands. So we build out really from that account in the diary and find works that play with it. And this, I suppose, testifies to how clearly there is a sense in Jarman's work of the invitation to do something that would be live as generating all of these other ideas. So a day later, he's already thinking of two men entwined in Rodin's Kiss, a bed with two boys asleep, a scarlet counterpane painted with the number 28, presumably alluding to Section 28, the government legislation that prevented local authorities in England from, quote unquote, promoting homosexuality. And then imagining paintings. He describes a virus painting, crucifix, KY, and condom. We have a painting from 1992 with KY scrawled on it. It seems like there were ripples from this moment, this invitation from Neil to be in Glasgow that really kind of testify to how important this combination of processes in Jarman's work at that time were, that he's thinking of paintings, he's thinking of a film that he's working on, the garden, he's thinking of this installation, he's thinking of the political situation. Anyway, to show you some examples of works that are in the show and how it kind of comes together, we have a number of loans from private collections and from the Jarman estate, courtesy of Amanda Wilkinson. And they include this is one of a number of quote unquote black paintings, something that Jarman started in the 1980s. This is one that alludes to the name of James Mackay's film production company, Dark Picture. And it's Dark Pictures, the text and these lines above come out of gold leaf that's been overpainted in black. And we have a kind of run of those works that go through the 1980s and show the subject matter starting to coalesce within those certain repeated motifs and phrases, elements that increasingly become collaged into them and start to allude to the materials Jarman was finding around Dungeness and, again, the AIDS crisis and his response to it. We have text on the wall. You can see the KY painting in the background there, and a piece of driftwood with a text etched on glass from the late 1980s. Again, this kind of connection between Dungeness, the political world Jarman was inhabiting, and these diary entries that relate to Glasgow. Some very poignant images and words in these. This is from a work in 1989, AIDS Memoir, Et in Arcadia Ego, I Was Here, Prospect Cottage, on a piece of foil added to this thickly painted canvas. And then I mentioned that alongside Jarman's work, we have works of contemporary art, some existing and some commissioned. This is an existing work by the artist Tom Walker, and he has edited together the documentary footage of Jarman's artist talk at the Third Eye Centre, with Keith in bed with another man, an audience gathered on the floor, and Derek answering questions and explaining the exhibition to this audience, lots of artists, art students, Neil Bartlett himself, visible and audible in this film. So it takes us right back to that moment of Derek Jarman in Glasgow. We have Sarah Wood's film, Beautiful Flowers and How to Grow Them, excuse me, from 2020. Very explicitly engaged with the film, The Garden, with Jarman's own material for that, which was included as one archive source, with earlier sources of that from that landscape and later ones too that think about how it is read today in the context of Britain's hostile environment and the people who are arriving onto the coastal shores of the south of England. So really perfectly exemplifying the exhibition's idea of digging in another time, which comes from Jarman's description of his own garden, that the gardener digs in another time. We've got other works by Sarah accompanying that, including this new project, which will be iterated throughout the exhibition in the form of postcards that she's sending that relate to her own research for a future film, which would return to Jarman's extraordinary rushes for the film The Garden. Inside the room where Sarah's work is shown, we also have this little set of works by Derek Jarman, etched glasses that show this sort of spilling over of his creative vision into all aspects of production. These are from a number that he made where he etches ideas and phrases and images onto wine glasses. We wanted to represent the different facets of Jarman's production through time, so filmmaking, writing, painting especially, and we commissioned the Glasgow artist Andrew Black to make some new paintings that would respond in a manner of his choosing to the example that Jarman set. And Jarman always said he made films like a painter, and in these works Andrew has kind of reversed that process, I think, and made paintings in the manner of a filmmaker, cross-fading different source imagery, sometimes homoerotic, sometimes from natural history, from kind of garden imagery, to produce paintings that make that fusion kind of indistinguishable. We can't quite ever tease apart the two different source images. So this is one such, and they also have, like Jarman's work, collaged elements added to the surface. This is bog asphodel that has been added to the surface of the painting. Very movingly, there's an image of a kind of catastrophe within the body of work that Andy's made. This painting on the left is by by Andy of a cottage, a rural cottage on fire, thinking, I suppose, of the way in which Jarman's work responded to catastrophic events in his own life, and that that sense of catastrophe and disaster might be echoed in our own moment in any number of ways. And when we turn on the news and think about what's happening in the world. And I think, though I haven't asked Andrew directly about this, that there must be an allusion here also to another famous image that emerged from the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, David Wojnarowicz's creation of this repeated image of a house on fire. Wojnarowicz, another artist who really made incredible activist work in response to his own and his peers' experience of the AIDS crisis, which would take his life. We also have photography in the exhibition. This is a work by Matthew Arthur Williams, a kind of poetic teasing out of layers of history in the city. So this is taken in an ornate building in Glasgow, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons. And within that space, Matthew created a kind of live collage of different source images. It includes a self-portrait photograph and an image of another pioneering queer cultural figure who made an important work for the Third Eye Centre, Julius Eastman. Julius Eastman was a Black American queer minimalist composer and musician whose work has really been overlooked for many, many years and has had a recent resurgence of interest. And one small part of that was the discovery in the Third Eye Centre archive of what is believed to be the only extant footage of him playing his own music, which turned out to be in Glasgow at the Third Eye. And the work kind of spills beyond its frame, and the banner that represents Julius Eastman becomes part of a larger installation in the show. So in this case, digging in another time means excavating these other queer histories from the fabric of the city that could so easily be forgotten. And I think that's my last slide. I haven't got images of the two film works in the show, which are a film of Derek Jarman's, I mentioned, My Very Beautiful Movie, and really another very beautiful film that Luke Fowler has made called Being Blue. And that those two films play back to back in a kind of cinema space, which is harder to photograph and will need to get documented professionally rather than by me. So I think they are real highlights of the show, actually, those two films that, again, move us from the 1970s into the present. And Luke's film was shot on location at Prospect Cottage and explores the traces of Jarman and Collins's life there using lots of different archival musical sources and some very beautiful new music as well. So that's the exhibition, and I'm very happy to take any questions should people have them. And I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Dominic. And yes, if anyone's got any questions, you can pop them in the chat. I had a question, Dominic. I know we've just touched on a few of the artists, the commissioned works that have been brought in response to Jarman's legacy, but I just wondered if you can touch a bit more on your decision making around bringing those things into conversation and why that was important for this exhibition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose one element would be that it felt like an opportunity to have that kind of conversation across time. And I suppose, well, yeah, it's a really good question, and it might have a longish answer. I'll try and keep it brief. One is that in thinking about doing this, Tom Walker's film was actually really important for me. That because we had conversations when he had a residency at the CCA about his interest in Jarman, and I suppose the encouragement of a younger artist who felt like this was an important and generative figure for them, even though they didn't have a first-hand memory. As I remember Jarman as a public figure. I wasn't in Glasgow in 1989. I didn't see that installation, but I remember hearing Jarman's voice on the radio, seeing him on TV. I remember his films being on television, and I remember him being in the press. So I was thinking, well, it does still speak. There's also something really interesting, I think, that happened in 2018. We had another exhibition with a kind of important queer art historical figure, Ulrike Oettinger. And as part of that, we ran an event around queer landscapes. And Lydia Honeybone invited Andrew Black to come and speak. And I invited James Mackay, Jarman's producer, who I'd got to know a little bit. And so we're seeing Andy's work and his thinking back to back with James's. And actually, Andy showed a film by Jade de Montserrat, and Jade is the other commissioned artist whose work is not yet made. It'll be a performance that happens at the end of the exhibition. So that constellation already of a conversation, it was starting to happen before there was a show. And then the other thing was really, I suppose, feeling like there have been a lot of great Jarman exhibitions. There's been this really big blockbuster show with everything in it. So what could we do that wouldn't be a repeat or a rerun? And I felt that conversation about a moment that was generative for Jarman, moving between Dungeness, London, Glasgow, making works that pass from one to the other. And I suppose that central thing, that the bed that's in the Third Eye Centre installation is also there in the garden. This porosity in his own work felt like maybe we could have other people enter that conversation. You know, we can't work directly with Derek Jarman. We can work with people like James who knew him, and Neil, and Simon Fisher Turner, who made new music for Blue now, and Amanda, who represents the estate, and so on. But actually the conversation would be between artists, and they would be responding to different facets. And then really it's a range of guessing about people who I knew that might be able to respond to that in an interesting way, and people who I knew had this really passionate interest. So yeah, it's just a kind of bringing that together. And I think there's some questions in the chat, so I better just open that and see.
So there is one here, I'll just read it out. It's is there an obvious shift in the style or content of Jarman's work post-diagnosis?
Yes and no, I would say. I think I have the sense of Jarman in this period has built up the resources for making art and film and writing that he will then use and apply to reckoning with what was happening to him and to others. And so we can see in that run of black paintings that are in the show that evolution is ongoing. He's an experimental artist. His work is constantly changing. Before he's diagnosed HIV positive, so he's diagnosed HIV positive on the 22nd of December 1986. Not long after, I mean, this is like an epic period for Jarman. He meets Keith Collins in this period. He buys Prospect Cottage, and he starts work on this sequence of films that, you know, some of the best things he's ever done, I think. And then he makes these incredible, important exhibitions and very powerful paintings. I think that the profound shift happens when, and it relates to Blue and some of those later paintings, the medication he was on starts to affect his eyesight. And so working with urgency and in this large format becomes much more important to him. So really see him going from working in his flat in London on a small scale to make these black paintings, very carefully worked surfaces, and often with very tiny textual inscriptions in them, to working on a much larger scale. And I suppose feeling like he was working on a public scale. He was a public figure. He was, you know, visible on outrage demos. He was involved in polemic activism. He was outspoken in the press and on the radio. So I think there is a shift that happens, but I think the shift is possible because he built up these incredible resources as just one of the best writers, I think, in about that period of time in British cultural life, like regardless of any other definitions you might put around it. He's incredibly brilliant as a writer. If you haven't read Modern Nature or any of his other journals, I just highly recommend it. He's great company in those journals. And so he's bringing that together, and he's also capable of making something like Blue, which is also returning to the sense of how do you fill an emptiness, like, which is there in some of the early black paintings. It's there in those landscapes we looked at. So I think it's just everything's converging, really. He's at the peak of his powers as an artist at that time and has very, very important subject matter to work with.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dominic. I think that's probably all that we have time for today, but thank you so much for today's talk. The exhibition is on until the 4th of May at the Hunterian Art Gallery, so you can come out and see that, hopefully. And as Dominic said, there will be a performance at the end of it as well, so look out for that on our website at some point soon. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and I hope you have a lovely weekend when it comes to it. Thanks again, Dominic.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.